North America was a relative economic backwater. We need to remember that as a slave system. The big money in 1720 or 1750, or even right on the eve of the American Revolution, the big money was in growing sugar in the West Indies. Islands like Jamaica were much more productive of revenue for the king's government than were Virginia and South Carolina. And it made a big difference in the way the slave system developed in America. One was that there weren't so many importations of slaves because the planters didn't have as much money, because their crops were different. They tended to bring in small increments of slaves through the slave trade. And over time, and it didn't take very long, like a generation, it was the early 1700s, there was an equal ratio between men and women. This was not the case in the West Indies and in other slave societies. In those societies, there would often be 3 or 4 men for every woman. But in North America, there was an equal ratio of men and women, and so the slaves tended to form families and communities. The slave force grew much more through reproduction than importation. So we had a slave force in the Chesapeake region and in South Carolina that was growing on its own, that was growing more by births than by importation. So that meant that increasing numbers of slaves by the 1730s, 40s, 50s, by the era of the American Revolution, were American-born. They were in the second, many were in the second, and some in the third generation of being born on these shores. And they developed a distinctive African-American culture with elements that were drawn from Africa, that they brought with them, with elements that were European, of their own choosing, I might add, and from Native Americans. So it had 3 streams of influence building an African-American culture. They used religion, folklore, music, and song as a protection against the oppressions of slavery. They were an enslaved people, but their mind and spirit, their psychology was their own. And this made slavery different in North America. You had a slave community. They had a slave culture that served as a psychological protection for the identity of the individuals in it. So they were enslaved. They were a people enslaved, but they weren't necessarily slaves, certainly mentally and in spirit. For the owners, it was also a different situation. They were not absentee owners. They lived on the plantations with the slaves. And this is quite different. That wasn't the case in the West Indies and other slave societies in the New World. They tried to bring a pre-modern concept of paternalism with them. Remember, we're at a transition point here between a pre-modern feudal era and a modern era where you're going to have really a capitalist system of production. And they tried to bring with them a pre-modern concept of paternalism, of being benevolent masters, of regarding the slaves as their people, as sort of an extended family, was the way that they felt about it. They soon found that it conflicted with the modern reality of the economics of slavery, right? Because we were making that transition into a modern era, and part of that modern era was trade and finance, and these were large capitalist operations, the plantations. They were some of the first modern ones in the modern world. And so you had to have a labor discipline. And the owners found that they had to apply harsh punishments, that the whip and the lash were not unknown, and that even masters that thought of themselves as benevolent, and were in many ways, masters like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, would have the lash would be used on their plantations. You know, it was just part of, it was built into the process of how it was going to have to work.